Adjourn this meeting in this memory. And seeing no other business at the regular City Council meeting, we will adjourn this meeting to the Redevelopment Agency. And I'd like to ask for a roll call, please.
Agency Member O'Connell.
Here.
Agency Member Ibarra.
Here.
Vice Chair Medina.
Here.
Chair Ruane.
Here. Approval of the minutes, regular meeting of October 27th. You have them up here. Any changes, additions? Seeing none, they'll stand approved. Consent calendar, we have nothing on the consent calendar. Public hearing, no public hearing tonight. Public comment, once again, the Brown Act prohibits the council from discussing or acting upon any matter not agendized pursuant to state law. Would anyone like to address the agency? Conduct of business, item number 6, oral presentation and consultant kickoff meeting for redevelopment 5-year implementation plan.
Through the chair. Before we begin, I just want to get clarification from the city attorney, since we will be discussing and going over elements of the transit corridor. And prior, I've had to recuse myself, and so has another member, and whether or not we are necessary to do that this time, or whether, since there's no action or decision making, that we're permitted to remain.
And I'd like to piggyback on that as well.
I was doing it for both of us.
As I understand it, 2 council members have property interests in the redevelopment area. And if city council members have property interests in the redevelopment area, there generally is a conflict of interest for the purposes of broad policy decisions like implementation of like the adoption of the 5-year implementation program for the RDA. And the reason for that is that the decision affects all of the properties in the RDA, and therefore by implication any individual properties that council members may hold. However, tonight that is not what you have before you. You're not being asked to adopt the implementation program, and you're not being asked to make any decisions about it. What is before you is an informational item in which the statutory requirements are going to be explained, and the process that the city is undertaking with respect to this implementation plan. Therefore, I find that there is no conflict of interest on the matter before you this evening because it is an informational item. The note of caution that should the discussion devolve into, which I don't anticipate to happen, any setting of specific priorities or financial priorities, then you would start to get into an area that would create that type of difficulty for you. So do you have any questions for me at this time?
Any questions of our attorney?
I think she's just telling us to stay seated.
Correct.
Bluntly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Honorable Chair, members of the Redevelopment Agency. The agency is completing its 10th year of operation. It was formed in 1999, and it's also completing its second 5-year implementation plan. As you know, implementation plans have to be prepared every 5 years, and we're now starting on our 3rd implementation plan. The agency has achieved a number of significant accomplishments in the last 10 years, such as planning for and facilitating development at the crossing, the former Navy site, which includes over 200 units of affordable housing and over 1,000 units of housing altogether. It has funded the construction of the police facility and improvements in the downtown, as well as the commercial facade improvement program. The agency is entering into a new phase as the crossing development nears completion and the downtown and transit corridors plan is in progress. The Transit Corridors Plan will provide an important roadmap to help to direct redevelopment activities in the future. The agency has engaged RSG Consulting to assist with preparing this 3rd implementation plan because it is a very important one. RSG has provided redevelopment consulting services for nearly 30 years and has prepared over 100 implementation plans and midterm reviews. We have Kathy Rosenau, a principal at RSG, and Susie Kim, who's the project manager on the implementation plan here. And Kathy will give the presentation on the upcoming 5-year implementation plan.
excuse us as we try to find our presentation. Here we go. Great. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and council members. What we intend to do tonight is to provide a general background on redevelopment, as well as introduce some of the things that are underway with regards to the preparation of this next 5-year implementation plan. To begin with, the San Bruno redevelopment project area, as Mark indicated, was adopted in 1999. It includes approximately 700 acres, largely centered around the downtown area. As Mark indicated, redevelopment law requires that a 5-year implementation plan, a 5-year implementation plan be completed. And in order to keep with that schedule, the intent is to bring the plan back to you in January for actual approval. So tonight we just wanted to introduce some of the initial concepts. The implementation plan is an opportunity to start prioritizing projects and programs for the next 5 years based upon the agencies and the city's needs and goals. One of the important things, because of all the work that's been underway on the downtown and transit corridor specific plan, will be blending some of the activities to implement potentially that plan with the redevelopment implementation. It's important to point out that an implementation plan under redevelopment law can be amended at any time. So if a year or 2 or 5 years from now there's a desire to make a change, it is within the agency's authority to do such. Redevelopment law requires that every redevelopment plan contains certain limits. And in addition, back when your plan was adopted, some limits were negotiated as part of your agreement with the county. These limits include, first, the plan duration, which is July 6, 2030. What that means is that's the time limit for commencing implementation activities, and when you do any kind of agreement that puts on a control for land use, the duration of that control should comply with that duration. The second limit is the limit on the receipt of tax increment and the repayment of debt. That gives you another 10 years, so July 6, 2040, to collect tax increment. The third is on incurring debt. Basically, the law says that you have 20 years to incur debt, so that would take you to July 6, 2019. That particular limit can be amended by going through a redevelopment plan amendment process. Next, eminent domain. There's a limit initially of 12 years, so your eminent domain limit is currently July 6, 2011. Again, that amendment could be amended through a process. Next, the tax increment limit of $550 million. This was one of those limits that wasn't required by law, but was the outcome of your negotiations with the county. If you were to want to amend that limit, it would likely be required to return and potentially renegotiate that agreement. The last is another limit required by law, and that's your bonded indebtedness limit of $200 million. You're well beneath that limit today. Overall, the purpose of redevelopment under California state law is to improve communities through the rebuilding and repair of infrastructure. Many of the projects that you've accomplished to date have certainly involved that. Revitalization of neighborhoods. There are a number of neighborhoods included within the project area boundaries. Producing affordable housing, which you've already undertaken and continue to do. Stimulating growth in commercial areas, including jobs creation, which obviously projects like the crossing and what you're contemplating potentially in the specific plan transit corridor would be such kinds of projects. Typically, redevelopment is most successful when it's a public-private partnership, when you have private interest investing back into new development within the community. How is redevelopment financed? Primarily through use of tax increment, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also redevelopment can be financed through grants from other entities, loans, bonds, developer advances, many sources of legal revenue to help facilitate redevelopment. Tax increment is actually a redirection of a portion of the tax that's generated from growth of property values, and that new growth, new property tax growth, goes to the redevelopment agency. It's important to point out that the redevelopment agency has no authority to increase taxes, either property taxes or any other kind of tax. It's a redirection of new property tax. By way of example, you can see in this slide what happens when you create the project area. It's called the base year tax revenue. All of that revenue continues to go to all of the affected taxing entities. And then as new private investment occurs and property values increase, the property tax that's generated by those new values is what goes to the redevelopment agency. Now, when the redevelopment agency receives tax increment, the law requires that 20% be set aside for the purposes of increasing and enhancing affordable housing. The law also requires that a portion be passed through to all of those affected taxing entities, and then what remains is left for the agency to spend on non-affordable housing projects. How that works out is 20% generally is in the low mod fund. Over time, approximately 30 cents goes back to the affected taxing entities, leaving approximately 50% for the non-housing projects. Mark has gone through some of those accomplishments of the redevelopment agency since its inception, so I won't spend more time going through those. You can see those on this slide as well as the next slide. Moving into the legal requirements for the 5-year implementation plan. Again, it has to be adopted every 5 years. You're also required to do a midterm review of that. That's an opportunity that many agencies use if they want to update their plan at that time. It's a good opportunity to do that because you have to hold the hearing just as you will in January. The law requires that the plan identify the goals of the project area and the proposed projects and programs that will be implemented, and an estimate of expenditures of tax increment over the next 5 years. It also requires that the plan describe how those projects will address existing blighting conditions. Part of the reason for forming a project area was to eliminate conditions that the redevelopment law refers to as blight. Another element is to assure that the redevelopment affordable housing requirements are implemented. There's certain mandates in law with regards to production of affordable housing. As you know, the city has been processing a downtown and transit corridor specific plan which will focus on a new development plan through the year 2030. The purpose of this specific plan is to foster new residential, office, retail, and hotel development. And another major focus is to enhance the transportation infrastructure, particularly related to public transit, bicycle, pedestrian, and also automobile transit. Now, the specific plan area conveniently overlaps well with the San Bruno, you can tell where I've been, project area, and its implementation will effectuate the redevelopment of key corridors within the San Bruno redevelopment plan. And so from that perspective, it's important that the implementation plan consider and include some of the implementation activities associated with a specific plan. For example, the specific plan as it exists today identifies a number of opportunity sites for potential new development, specifically along the San Bruno, El Camino, and San Mateo corridors. An example of one of those would be the potential reuse of this closed building at 111 San Bruno Avenue with a potential new development showing ground floor retail with residential above the retail. Now, redevelopment provides special tools to help implement those kinds of projects. One of those tools is owner participation. There's a mandate in law that owners, existing property owners and businesses, be given a priority to be involved in redevelopment and to potentially enter into contracts with the agency to accomplish redevelopment. The agency also has the authority to acquire property for the purpose of land assemblage, so that if there are numerous small lots that no longer make sense in today's economy and real estate marketplace, those can be consolidated and assembled for potential new development. Also, funding public infrastructure and facilities is an important tool redevelopment agencies have. The reality is, in most cases, implementation of those kind of projects require a combination of all of those forms of tools. Successful redevelopment will likely result from focusing on opportunity sites. And opportunity sites are particularly those where there are willing landowners or participants, where the market is ready, where the real estate market has reached a point where it can accommodate that kind of development, where the development is financially viable and the financing is available to invest in it, and where there's a willing developer who is willing to invest in that property. Now, the details of how the implementation of the specific plan are to occur are still in an infancy stage. And so as we focus now back on the 5-year implementation plan, one of the items that we're suggesting is that the plan focus on more broad programs at this juncture, with the idea being that over time, the programs could be more specifically developed. And at this point, what we intend to do is introduce 4 primary programs and then give examples of specific projects that could be implemented under those. So the first of those would be implementation of the specific plan, and particularly the potential for the opportunity sites and the infrastructure improvements that the specific plan has already identified as needed. A second major category to be included in the implementation plan would be the infrastructure improvements, including accessible pedestrian ramps, the sidewalk repair program, the street rehab program. Many of these are ongoing programs that the agency has historically been involved with. The third would be to promote economic development. We know one of the items that's been of interest to the city is to attract a hotel developer to the crossing. Another might be involving local business training in conjunction with Skyline College. A next would be a business attraction and retention program with the focus of targeting new retail into the area. A fourth would be ongoing project area beautification, including commercial rehabilitation, improvements to the city's gateways and signage, and also continued support for the code enforcement program within the project area. As part of our development of the implementation plan, we also are analyzing potential tax increment generation that could occur over time. Currently, in the year 2009-10, we estimate that the agency will receive approximately $4.6 million of revenue. Now, that's after those pass-through payments have been made and after the basic aid school districts have received their share and after the administration and operating expenses. So your revenue is on the upswing, and you know it's showing that there has been investment over the last 10 years. What we did then was said, well, let's look at two scenarios just for purposes more of illustrating what the potential growth may be. So the first scenario looked at a minimal growth and minimal new development, essentially a 3% growth in values over the next 25 years. And as you can see from the chart, those are the boxes shown in blue. The second scenario, we looked at those three catalytic opportunity sites that were identified in the specific plan, kind of looked at the performance that were done for those and said, you know, there's an opportunity potentially if these three moved ahead for the addition of approximately $200 million in value. And we just, for, again, illustrative purposes, said, what if that came on over 12 years, beginning in 2 years out? What would it look like then? And as you can see, what happens is in the early years, the boxes are closer to the same size. And as the effects of new development occur over time, there's a multiplier effect in a level of tax increment that's generated. So we wanted just to present this for generic purposes. It would require a lot more detail in terms of, is this going to be reality? So we just really wanted to introduce the concept that new value equals a new tax increment and well into the future. Also related to that, we took those two streams of tax increment and said, what if we looked at potential bonds that could be secured by tax increment over the next 15 years? Again, just for illustrious purposes. And under the scenario one, again, the more conservative growth scenario, it's estimated that bond issues in excess of $44 million could occur over the next 15 to 20 years. Under the second scenario, that would increase to over $70 million. Now, the gross proceeds obviously will vary substantially because of the additional tax increment that's available to leverage into bonds. It's estimated that the first bond issue could be done possibly if the market were to improve in the year 2010-11, and that could potentially yield approximately $30 million in gross proceeds. Over time, the gap becomes closer to $27 million if redevelopment is successful and if that kind of new $200 million over 10 years can be realized into the future. The other mandated component of an implementation plan has to do with the redevelopment agency's affordable housing requirements. In this regard, it's our opinion thus far that you're meeting your mandates. We understand that there is the potential new project on San Mateo Avenue that's already been approved. It's like a lot of projects right now, it's hard to get financing, but we suspect as the market turns around that project can move forward. Other potential new affordable programs would be potential rental subsidy programs, residential rehab programs, identifying opportunity sites in the downtown and transit corridors area for affordable housing, and then ultimately to develop a long-term affordable housing production strategy that makes use of that 20% set aside to produce housing that meets all market levels in the community. In summary, the 5-year implementation plan for council consideration in January, as we intend, will identify flexible programs to be implemented over time, but it will list specific example projects. And also it will demonstrate that the redevelopment agency will meet its affordable housing compliance requirements, and will also begin the specific plan implementation strategy as it overlaps and interrelates with redevelopment. Next steps will be to adopt the implementation plan in January based on any recommendations coming from the community and the council. Again, starting that process of developing a strategy for redevelopment. Also, next steps would be to work with the council and the community to identify top needs and goals for the project area. Then, specifically prioritizing projects and programs across short-term and long-term, looking not just at 5 years, but 10 years and 20 years out. And lastly, next steps would be future meetings held to decide specifically how money should be spent over the next 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. That concludes my presentation. We're available to answer any questions you may have, and certainly to consider any input that the council has at this point in time. Thank you.
I have a quick question. Given the state of the state, and they're talking about rating funds, what happens with all of these time limits, and do they get extended? I mean, do we get the benefit in some way, shape, or form of getting an opportunity to make this money back with an extended time period?
Well, historically, when the state has taken redevelopment funds in the past, they have done 1 year, 2 year extensions on some of those time frames. The current legislation, which was adopted with regards to the fiscal year we're currently in, does not include one of those provisions. And as I'm sure you're well aware, the California Redevelopment Association has again filed lawsuit against the state, as we did last year, to challenge the state's legal standing in taking those funds.
Councilwoman O'Connell.
Thank you. First of all, with the eminent domain, it ends in 2019. Is that, am I doing?
2011.
I'm sorry, 2011. Yeah. And you said it can be extended. How long can it be extended, and how much lead time before that do you need to start working on an extension for that? And for that, and also for the incurring the debt?
The eminent domain extension can be done for an additional 12 years, as much as 12 years. And it's actually somewhat of a simple form amendment, although it does require the certain documentation of existing conditions and substantiation of the need for continuing that authority. Generally speaking, I would say an eminent domain extension could be done within 6 months time frame. And yeah, so you'd want to start that process within probably 6 to 8 months prior to your expiration date. With regards to incurring debt, it's a little bit of a longer process, and I would say you may want as much as a year lead time for that type of amendment.
Okay, and then for that amendment, you said the eminent domain could be extended for as much as 12 years, and the other one could be extended for how long?
The duration of the plan, so you could take it out to 2030.
Oh, okay. And, okay, thank you.
Mr. Ibarra.
I'd like to say that I'm very proud to be sitting here in, 10th year of redevelopment and colleagues. Yeah, I think it's a good time. And with your experience with working with redevelopment agencies, I'd like you to comment on how, I'd like to think that we're well positioned, especially even with what's going on in the economy and stuff. We have specific plans. We are positioning ourselves. We know what we want, and plus we've got, we're anticipating a healthy stream of funds, redevelopment funds coming in. So if you can comment on that, as far as with your experience, how does San Bruno look, in this next implementation plan?
As they say in bad economic times, it's time to have everything shelf ready. And I think the timing of your specific plan is very good. That you're completing that process, and that you're focusing on opportunity sites. I mean, that's key. It's always hard when you have 700 acres to work with. Where do you start? And having gone through a rational process to focus on particular opportunities sites for a number of different reasons makes a lot of sense. And so I think you are well positioned, and because you do not currently have any outstanding bonds that are a pledge of tax increment, a direct pledge of tax increment, you are in a position to potentially consider a bond issue at the appropriate time, both when the market is in good stead and when you've identified where you would spend that money. I think it's important to do it at the time when you know why you're getting it and where it's going to go.
Plus we got this big train thing going on, too.
Yeah, you've got places to spend it.
Good. Any other questions, comments? Thank you. We look forward to seeing you in January.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.